Number 2, monthly financial report. Mr. Bell.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Superintendent, board members. You have the August financial report of disbursements in front of you. You can see from the comparison to last August, the trends are in our favor. The month of August receipts, month to date, were $24,350,000 compared to expenditures or disbursements for the month of August of $22,748,000. So certainly, as the tax collections are gearing up in this month, we actually collected more than we spent, which is a good sign for the remainder of the year. If you look back to the left side of the first page, you'll see that the year-to-date for FY14, we've collected $29.7 million and spent $33.7 million. Not an unusual gap at this point in the year. But if you go to the rightmost column, you'll see that back in FY13 in August a year ago, that we had collected $24.2 million and actually spent $38.5 million. So on a larger budget, 759.9 to 732, we are collecting more and spending less in this, the first part of the year. The next page, the pie chart that y'all are used to seeing, indicates just on a proportionate basis that we've spent at the 33.7, 4% of the 755,927 general operations budget, and we have unexpended 96% of the budget. On a straight line basis, divided by 12, of course, that'd be about 16.5%. If each month is 8.333, then that certainly doesn't work out in all cases. The third page in is a trend line analysis, and we've added some information that was requested in terms of where we are in terms of actual receipts compared to our projections. You will see that the top of the page, our projected collections would be $22.6 million, and as of the end of August, we're at $29.706 million, so we're up. On the local revenue sources, we projected $14.2 million. We're at $19.999 million. And on the state sources, we had projected $8.421 million. And as of the end of August, we're at $9.7 million in terms of collections. So overall, our collections, our revenue collections, are ahead of where we projected they would be. Okay. Going forward, we'll try to do some kind of analysis on where we project the expenditures to be. But as I said, in the summer months, the startup months, a straight line analysis at 8.333% wouldn't be that telling, though we are pulling together first quarter information right now and considering the encumbrances. With that, I'm prepared to take any other questions that you might have. The vendor spend report has also been transmitted. We have done various iterations of the vendor spend report for the board and for specific, based on specific questions. We'll continue to work on it to see if we can get everybody satisfied.
Questions? Mr. Campbell.
Dr. Bell.
Yes, sir.
Great job with the explanation. I'm beginning to understand these reports a lot better, so I only have a couple of questions this time. Behind the bar chart that you talked about, the chart that you just referenced,
Okay.
a couple of pages back when you take a look at the statement of receipts and disbursements, on the disbursement side, if you look at other costs and you compare fiscal year 14, I'm speaking of other expenses under other costs under the disbursement side. If we compare $568,000 fiscal year through August 14 to fiscal year 2013, 568 to 129. What's driving?
What page number are you on?
I am, is it page number?
On page 5?
Page 5, yes, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Right.
Page 5, other cost. Under the disbursement, about four lines down from the top of the page. Under instructional. And I'm speaking of 568,000 versus 129,000 for the same time last year. Why? Significant cost in printing cost. Just general discussion on it.
Yeah, in these other cost categories, there's a lot of variability. We'd have to take a look specifically and see. There were some specific questions that were submitted to us that we've answered. Right now, we just have to dig into that and see why there would be some flexibility. I can't answer that specifically.
Okay, and then if you look year-to-date, fiscal year 14, 802,000 to 198, that's part of the same analysis there.
Yes, sir.
While I ask that question, let me commend you and the superintendent on a job well done. If you go down several lines, legal expenses, again, we're doing a much better job. Maybe I should ask that question. Yeah, job well done, I should say. 109,000 versus 757,000 this time last year. So job well done.
So far, yes, sir.
That's fine. Still early in the game, huh? A great job between you and the superintendent in trying to control those costs.
Mr. McMahon.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Bell, I apologize for sending emails so late. I sent one this morning at 9:45. It is what it is. And we're working as a board to be better prepared, work with the administration to get questions to you sooner than the day of a meeting. And so we'll figure that out going forward. With that being said, you know, I don't have a question on the consolidated. It's on vendor spend. So is it appropriate time right now to speak about vendor spend, or you want to?
Sure, it's part of the package, yes, sir.
Okay. And I was able to convert the PDF into an Excel to be able to format, you know, and drive the data. And that was part of the email earlier today. If you can potentially see if we can have that format in the future. I have not conferred with the board. It would be I don't know if a policy change or what, but it has been well received, and you did respond to Mr. Mayfield's questions. Can you explain, as I was going through the vendor spend, there's several different codings for different columns, and so we're speaking of legal, and on vendor spend, I will go to page bottom of page, let's see here, excuse me, 8, bottom of 8, okay, which is Alexander and Associates. And there's different, I'm looking at the column, which is two different ones. You got type and then status, the column headings, type and status. And if you can explain for my benefit and the board's, BLKT, the differences between that and norm and DPay.
Sure, yes, sir. The BLKT just indicates that that's a blanket purchase order. A blanket purchase order is a purchase order that is a larger amount that applies to sort of a class of service, and it's not a PO in the name of a particular company. Okay?
Could we equate that to a retainer?
Not exactly. A retainer is something that you already pay to the company. A blanket purchase order is like you might have 4 or 5 vendors operating under a blanket purchase order for some kind of universal work, like landscaping or something like that, and you pick individual companies to go and do the work, and they all draw on the same PO,
Okay.
okay? A retainer would be something you pay monthly and under a contract just to retain the company in question. So, yeah, we use blanket purchase orders. Sometimes they present some challenges in relation to accounting tracking, but they're a common practice in all the governments around here.
All right.
All right. D-pay is a direct pay. Okay, that's company XYZ company would get a contract for $125,000, and they get a purchase order for $125,000. It's in their name.
And norm just as normal?
Yeah, normal would be a normal sort of PO process. TRVL is a travel payment.
Can you explain the difference between direct pay and normal?
No, sir, I can't. Not at this time.
Okay.
I'll get it for you.
Appreciate that. The next column happens to be status. And I see posted, closed, paid. Explain those.
Well, posted would be that, you might have the invoices in, and it's in process. Closed is going to be that it's paid. That particular PO is exhausted. There are various categories of payments that are in process all the time. Keep in mind that this is for the year as of September 19th. So it just doesn't carry the 13 with it coming forward. Remember, at the end of 13, we had like a 700 or 800 page vendor spend report. Now it's about 80 pages.
Correct.
Yeah.
Would you be able to explain the processes in place for receiving invoices? Is there a procedure in place administratively for once a invoice is received? I've noticed we have invoice dates, which tell me if I'm wrong, is the date of the invoice. We may not have received it on that date.
That's correct.
But that's the date that they have posted, and then we have a posted date, I guess, of when and then a pay date.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand the process.
Yes. Under the standard process, when a vendor would be engaged and have a contract to provide services, they should be put into our vendor database, okay, and receive a vendor number, okay? What happens, not just here, but in a lot of places, someone engages a company, and then we got to get the vendor in the vendor file, okay? And the staff should, at that point, when there's a legitimate contract, process a purchase order, okay? And that ought to go into the system and wait for the invoices to come in. And when the invoices come in, the date of the invoice logically should be after the date of the purchase order, okay? If people aren't diligent about processing the purchase order, when an invoice comes in for the services rendered, okay, all of a sudden it'll be, oh, we got to process this invoice, and sometimes we see there's not even a PO in the system, even though it's a legitimate expense of the school district, okay? So then the PO is processed, and then you have a situation which some of the accountants have observed where you will have an invoice dated before the PO date, okay? And we've had some observations in prior reports about that. That's just an issue relative to people taking appropriate actions at the right time. We do training on that. We go and visit different areas and do specific training, but if somebody gets something and it sits on their desk until then all of a sudden an invoice comes in and it presents a problem.
I can see that, where it could present a problem. In your best estimate, how far back on a realistic standpoint do we have invoices that wind up at your desk that are, how old would they be? What's the worst case scenario?
I haven't taken a look at it, I do know that when we ended 13 and then we rolled into 14, there was some, as we're, rolling the 14 budget, people would say, oh, I've got this stuff for 13 and, we need to pay it. Then you get into an accrual problem.
Right.
Normally we have about 60 days where a 13 expense that comes in at the beginning of 14, I can legitimately go back and pay it out of 13, which is where it ought to be. Okay? But I think 60 days ought to be the outside limit. I haven't looked at the problem specifically. But it's just a question of moving the process timely.
And I greatly appreciate your clarity on that. If you don't mind, I'll let Mr. Orson ask a question, but just real quick, if you, once after that, just go down the headings of the vendor spend, just for clarity. I know vendor name, year-to-date paid amount, invoice number, invoice date, paid amount, invoice entry date, PO number. That's an internal process for us.
Yes.
Right? And then type, you answered those. Status, fiscal year, that's if you were to pay something that was due last year and hit last year's budget, it would be denoted in that fiscal year column. Is that correct?
It should, but we're well into 14 now, past 60 days, and so this is all 14.
Right. But that's, if it were to happen, that's where it would wind up. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then I got check number, check date is when the actual check was cut from here. Correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Division name is the department that it's coded to.
Division, yes.
Right. And then within the division, we have certain, is that project departments, codings for that? Can you elaborate?
Yes, sir. It indicates if there's a specific project inside the department, what area.
Okay. And then the descriptor code, the accounts, are those Georgia codes or DeKalb County codes? And that's where we're going to take us like 9 months to align ourselves with the Georgia codes?
The state chart of accounts. Right now, these are but over the past couple of years, we've moved and made a lot of adjustments in that area, but right now there are DeKalb County School District accounting structure, yes.
Right. And then the last column, FPBK year.
I think this is, again, a statement of what year it's booked in.
Is that different from F year?
I'd have to check and see. I can't answer that exactly.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'll let Mr. Orson.
Mr. Orson and then Mr. Mayfield.
Thank you. Dr. Bell, to sort of continue this, I think we're all trying to learn this. Let me ask you a general question first, which is, you talked about essentially a reconciliation back to the prior fiscal year, and you were sort of using 60 days as a benchmark. Because my experience in the corporate world has been, obviously things trail through the system and you want to account for them against the correct fiscal year, but at some point you got to close the books out. And so what I'm hearing is that you're basically using a 60-day that would take us through the end of August for reconciling back to the prior fiscal year.
Well, certainly not in all cases. A lot of times things will be encumbered. That's this appropriations payable number that we talked about during the budget process, about $7 million. That came in about 5.4.
Right.
Okay, so, I mean, that is a legitimate accounting impact on the prior year. And when we display the budget to y'all, we estimate as to what that number would be.
Okay, so then related to that, my next question would be, and then I have some specific questions, would be, at what point do this vendor spend report, sort of the timetable, when does it hit the revenue and expense report? So the legal expenses are kind of an interesting example. We showed essentially no expenses last month, if I recall, on the budget report, and a de minimis amount, but when you look at the vendor spend report, there's significant expenses in the legal area. So when does something actually hit our revenue and expense report for those reporting purposes?
The financial report is on a modified accrual basis, okay? This spend report is really on a cash basis, okay? So there's a little bit of a play between them, right?
Right.
But, you're raising a good point about the legal expenses, but they ought to be for services rendered in 14, in the vendor spend report.
Okay, so let's get to the specifics here. And I'm looking at, and I've got a couple questions here. Since our friend Rocco is here today, let's look at the Sutherland lines, which are on page 64 or 74. I'll give you a moment to get to those. $60, 64 of 74, yes.
$64, did you say?
Yes. Basically, it's Sutherland, so it's following alpha order.
Okay.
So looking down at just to start with, the fourth entry, which is an amount for $158,000 and change. And it shows an invoice date, if I'm reading this correctly, of January 25th, 2013. And I'm trying to figure out why it didn't have an entry date until September 9th of 2013.
Sorry, I found the Sutherland. It's on my page 67. But
Okay. So in the fourth line down,
okay,
it would be invoice number 665799.
I see it.
It has an invoice date of, if I'm reading that correctly, January 25th.
I see it.
And it has an invoice entry date in our system of September 9th. And I know this predates you. I'm just trying to figure out what happens to an invoice for $160,000 sitting around.
I would have to say, and I don't know if Mr. Ramsey's in the room. Okay. There was a lot of work being done on processing legal fees, and there were a lot of questions about it. I think possibly during this process there was some delays in moving forward. But if Mr. Ramsey's in the room, I'd invite his comments on it.
I am. Good afternoon, Mr. Orson, members of the board. Again, we do process the billings that come in on a regular basis. Oftentimes we question some of the things that are in the billings, and we then refer those to the superintendent and or have conferences with council regarding those matters before they're approved and sent on to finance.
8 months?
I don't understand I can't speak to the actual item that you're speaking to right now, but we'll research it and respond back to you.
Okay, now going above that, and this goes to the point you made, Mr. Bell, the second invoice is dated, it's in invoice 681130 in the amount of $95,000.
I see it.
It's got an entry date, invoice date of 06, June 25th, an entry date of July 8th, but it looks like it has been posted against the 2014 fiscal year.
Okay.
And the conversation we just had for that sort of 60-day window about reconciling it, that would seem to be inconsistent with going back to the 2013 fiscal year to get an accurate picture.
Yeah, that does appear to be correct, what you're saying, but if this stuff was moved forward after we closed the books completely on 13, okay, then there's no other place to pay it except for out of 14.
Right, but this was paid, it looked like, on July 11th, so if you continue. And right, check date says 2013-07-11.
I'd have to take a look at that one in particular.
Okay, and I don't want to belabor the point. I mean, there's lots of examples, but the problem is, and I think we're feeling that we have some systems issues, and
right.
We know that they predate the superintendent and you, but in our ability to ensure the public that we are being honest and forthright in our numbers, which has been an area of great concern, we not only have to have the rules of the road, and I accept, for example, that you'll use a 60-day window for reconciling a previous fiscal year. That's not unreasonable. But then we have to actually be abiding by it. And if we have some systems issues, again, this isn't directed at personally, we've got to really address these systems issues, or we're going to continue to have a lack of confidence in the public.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Superintendent and Mr. Mayfield, do you mind? No. Okay, go ahead.
Well, first, as it relates to legal fees, I found that this particular component of our operations was somewhat out of control. And so I actually implemented a different policy whereby the superintendent would sign off on any payment to any attorney. And consequently, I personally now look at all the invoices along with Mr. Ramsey. That has slowed the process, but at the same time, it's resulted, I believe, in significant savings for the district. When I came, I was concerned about the amount of money, as most stakeholders are, that we were investing or spending on attorney's fees. And so I believe that the process we put in place has created much more consistency as it exists now. And I think one of the proposals we will look at today is really focused on helping us develop the kind of systems that you suggest we need, and I agree with going forward. We enter the 8th month of the administration, and I believe that the next step is to put in those systems and metrics that we need so that the board and members of the public can look, I think, with a much more look at a more transparent organization. It was not there, and we just have to continue to build and to make sure that it is there.
Mr. Chair, may I just make one comment in response to the superintendent, which is, and I appreciate that we need the metrics about kind of the appropriateness of spending, but this is really a processing problem, which is not a governance issue. I mean, if we set a rule that if it went through all your checks and balances, this was an invoice approved on and paid on July 11th. So based on Dr. Bell's representation, it should have been posted against the 2013 fiscal year. And this is, again, these are the small things that have a cumulative effect, that we just need to make sure our systems are following what our intent and what our publicly stated process is.
Well, I think having transparent and effective systems is a part of governance.
I agree with that.
Step of it, and I agree with you. And once again, with the attorney's fees, I made a battlefield decision that we were going to shut down at least what I saw was unfettered spending on attorney's fees. And I think it's resulted in significant savings for, at least thanks to this board, a major reduction in what will be a major reduction in attorney's fees this year. And once we can put some additional systems and processes in place and the training of the people who administer the processes, I think we'll have even more savings in the current fiscal year than we are already enjoying right now.
Mr. Mayfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Bell, for the comprehensive response to the questions that I submitted on last week. I really appreciate it. But I would like to make one comment and then ask two questions. Maybe I'll start with the questions by asking, and this relates to the question that I sent pertaining to the difference in the parent spend patterns between 2013 and 14 for the instructional piece, the disbursements. And one of the responses to explain the difference has to do with professional services and professionals and technical services that were provided to DeKalb Charter School to the tune of roughly $632,000. And I guess my question is, what would drive those expenses to be measured against the instructional budget as opposed to charter school budgets?
Yes, sir, Mr. Mayfield. I think you're thinking about your question number 4, the August comparison.
Right.
Okay. It's the $632,000 in the answer doesn't refer to DeKalb Charter School. There's professional and technical services that are part of that number you're citing for $632. But the DeKalb Charter School was the payments to DeKalb since the beginning of the year for $371,000. You're interpreting the answer as overlapping.
Okay, so this 371 is not within the 632.
That's correct.
It's incremental to it.
I don't think it is, no, sir.
You don't? I'm sorry?
I'm going to have to go back and take a look at that item. It says 630 in purchases of professional services. Yeah, in the 632, the 371 is to DeKalb, but the 632 is not all to DeKalb.
Right, and so my question is why that portion of the DeKalb, of that 632, why that number is in instructional disbursements as opposed to charter?
I think it's just a payment to DeKalb Charter School. There I start up this year. I think that's why it was put in there.
Okay.
I don't think it shouldn't indicate that we're providing any particular instructional services to them. It was their payment, the July and August payment.
So payments that we make to charter schools aren't counted as disbursements under charter schools. They're counted from other departments?
I think Globe is just kind of an outlier right now because it is our startup. I'm not sure it's correctly in that location.
So you don't think this is reported correctly? Is that
Maybe not. We'll have to check further into it.
right? And so that's my question that I'm hoping to get an answer to.
Okay.
The first question. The second question has to do with the justifications for budget adjustments. And obviously, there were I can't remember the exact number. But the response was that there aren't any categorical justifications for budget adjustment. It's based on. And so I guess my question, maybe this should be directed really more to the superintendent's office, not to Mr. Thurman specifically, but to understand if there are requirements or should be requirements, categorical requirements that would enable a department to adjust their budget and it not be clear, I guess would be my question.
Mr. Superintendent, if I could just say that what the answer said, I think there aren't any formal budget justifications or justifications for budget adjustments. There is a rule that we allow budget adjustments exclusive of salary and benefits up to 10% to be modified within the functional area.
Okay.
Okay. But the practice here is that the budget unit managers sort of have a lot of discretion when they request to have a budget adjustment. If it doesn't violate that rule, then we go ahead and do it. We allow them to be sort of the arbiter. But if they get up, if they violate the 10% rule, then it's got to go higher up.
Okay. So within 10%, they have the discretion.
Other than not modifying salary and benefits, yes, sir.
All right. And I guess my statement would be, based on the line of questions that you've heard so far, I would, I guess, maybe request of the superintendent, maybe we could have a workshop to help us get our arms around both the financial statements as well as the transaction reports or cash flow statements that we have, as well as understanding how we capture the use of our assets. In this case, I asked the questions regarding TANs to supplement so that we have a full understanding of the transactions that are taking place on a monthly basis.
Yes, sir. In relative to your question, the TANs are shown on page 14.
Right.
But it doesn't say, it doesn't say TANS, okay?
Right. It's shown in the balance sheet, but I mean in terms of capturing the difference between the revenues that we took on the income statement.
Right.
It's not reflected, right? We don't show that. Essentially, the net of it of August would have been a negative without the TANs.
Well, yeah, they're shown in accounts payable and in cash position. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, in response to Mr. Mayfield, I think the chairman several months ago developed a strategy whereby workshops are set up from time to time so that interested board members who desire to dig deeper in any part of the operation would have the opportunity to do so. And at the direction of the chair and the board, I'll be happy to talk with the managers involved to set up those workshops so that board members will have the opportunity not just to hear but to ask any questions in even most detailed manner, so that we can make sure that everyone has access to the knowledge and information they desire. And I'm at the chairman's pleasure as to when the time and place to do that.
Right. And hopefully expedite this portion of our board meeting.
And if you would, Mr. Superintendent, at your leisure, we will have Margaret to poll the board members that might be interested in the first workshop, up to 4, no more than 5, no more than 4, not 5. That would be a quorum. So we would do that. Margaret, if you would poll the board and coordinate it with the superintendent and his staff, if you will. Yes.
We can certainly have 5 weeks. She would just have to post the meeting as a meeting there. So there's nothing that prohibits us from having more than 4.
Okay. Any other questions? Mr. McMahon?
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Bell, back on that, we'll get off this mice type and get into the big picture again. Would it be possible, I greatly appreciate your macro view with your pie chart, and year to date we've established our budget for fiscal 14. Would it be possible to add monthly projections for revenues and expenses so that we can essentially have I think in the industry they call it a monthly variance report, where if we are, and we've experienced it already, where revenue has come in higher than the previous year, but and we can poll the board, or I don't want to speak for everybody else, but I think it would be helpful to see what we're expecting to spend, and I know the number's around 65 million a month for operating expenses, but can we have those monthly projections on revenue and expenses going forward, just so we can make sure that we're tracking? And in addition to that, our projections for our cash balances, because I know the superintendent and the board have goals to increase our reserves to a more sustainable level, so we can have our teachers fully employed again, and then have the reserves available to weather another potential downturn in the economy. So monthly cash balances and projections to where we can show where we're growing and building, and that's just from my point of view. So that's it.
We'll look at structuring like you say, a variance report. Just keep in mind that when we were talking about how the budget administration is really diffused here, and a lot of different individuals can decide to spend when they want to spend, okay? That's why it's difficult in this beginning of the year just to sort of straight line an 8.33. We're not there yet. In terms of actual disbursements on a cash basis, we're at 4 or 5%, okay? On an encumbrance basis, though, when you take the encumbrance accounting system and you take a look at that, we're about 24, 25, 26% encumbered. So that would be that 8.33 times July, August, and September. Okay, but yes, we'll take a look at structure. You're thinking about, say, one page. You could, it's difficult, but if you could get if you were to go and look at the detail of the monthly financial report, you could pull all that together. But you want a summary page, a variance report that shows where we thought we would be with revenue. This is where we are. Where we thought we'd be with expenses. This is where we are. Okay, yes, sir. We'll take a look at doing that.
Any opposition to placing this item on the consent agenda? Let me know by a show of hands. Hearing none, it will be placed on the consent agenda.